Welcome to Washington Watch. My name is Joseph Backholm, sitting in for Tony today. Remind you that the website is tonyperkins.com, where you can watch this and every episode live or on demand at tonyperkins.com. This week, U.S. and Russian delegations will be meeting amid rising tensions over the buildup of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine, which the Biden administration has been trying to deter with the threat of sanctions, a threat that the Kremlin has shrugged off. Yesterday, during an interview with George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the Biden administration has offered two paths to Russian President Vladimir Putin, one through diplomacy and dialogue, and the other through deterrence and massive consequences. When asked what those massive consequences are, Secretary Blinken had this to say.
We've been working in tremendous collaboration with European partners and allies and beyond to make it very clear that there will be massive consequences for Russia if it renews its aggression, by which I mean economic, financial, and other consequences.
Is it going to work? Well, with me now to talk about this and make sense of everything happening in Russia and Ukraine is national security and foreign policy expert James Jay Carafano, Vice President of the Heritage Foundation's Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute. He's also a 25-year Army veteran who has served in Europe, Korea, and the United States. James, welcome to the program.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
We are so glad to have you. This is an important topic that I know a lot of us don't know enough about, and I'm thankful for the chance to discuss this with you. And first, to set the scene, what are the meetings taking place this week?
So there's actually three sets of meetings this week. One is a direct dialogue between the United States and Russia. One is a meeting called the NATO-Russia Council. So that'd be the United States, all the members of NATO represented, and the Russians. And the third is a meeting of the OSCE. So what's really interesting about these is none of these really feature Ukraine. So most of this dialogue is going back and forth without really a major diplomatic engagement by the Ukraine. And I think that actually is part of the problem, because it really marginalizes Ukraine, because in the end, it's their land, their people that are really at risk here. And they've got the least powerful diplomatic voice in the debate.
Well, I believe, if memory serves, the Czech Republic once got given away at a meeting in their own country that they weren't part of either. And so maybe there's some precedent for this, unfortunately. Is the purpose of these meetings explicitly to just stop a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think it's being framed in the broader context of relations between Europe and the United States. But let's be honest, none of this would be going on right now if Russia was not actually threatening an invasion of Ukraine. We just briefly ought to talk about what we're really talking about here. There's 44 million people in the Ukraine, 44 million people. They are united in their opposition to the Russians on this. And many of these people are actually ethnic Russians. If Russia invades, there will be a real war, and the Ukrainians will fight really hard, and it will be very, very bloody. And part of that could well be millions of Ukrainians forced out of their own country, which will create a massive refugee flood into Western Europe. And let's not be foolish. This is not about Ukraine. This is about Putin wanting to expand his sphere of influence, destabilize NATO, and drive the United States out of the transatlantic community. So regardless of what happens, this doesn't end here, and it doesn't end in Ukraine. That's what's at stake. And so to your point that you made is, well, what are we doing? Well, so far the administration has put on the table the threat of sanctions, which even the administration knows is meaningless. Russia, Iran, look, even Venezuela, these regimes are really sanctions proof in the sense that they control their economies. So they can always funnel whatever money they have to support the things that they want to do. So sanctions are they're a punishment, but they're not a deterrent, because that's already factored in by these countries ahead of time. So that's meaningless. And then what these meetings are about, and what Blinken laid out there, is their goal is to essentially de-escalate the situation. Well, that makes no sense, because de-escalation sounds like both sides need to cool off and back down. This isn't about, this is about Putin threatening war. He created the escalation, therefore he has no motivation to de-escalate unless he gets concessions. So it's very, very difficult to see how the administration has postured itself for successfully pushing back against the Russians when they've literally put nothing on the table so far that the Russians really worry about.
James, to try to understand a bit of where Putin's coming from, why Ukraine? Why not Lithuania? Why not Estonia? Why not Georgia? What's the history there that makes him particularly interested in Ukraine?
Well, that's a great question. So Putin right now, so there are two different kinds of states on Putin's border. One are the former Warsaw Pact countries, right? So these were countries which essentially were controlled by Moscow during the Soviet era. Poland, the Czech Republic, which is part of Czechoslovakia, Romania. So they were countries that Russia occupied after World War II, and they stayed by essentially putting in puppet governments, which were answerable to the Soviet Union, and then putting together the Warsaw Pact, which was much about having a military to control those countries as it was about threatening NATO. The other is what's called former Soviet states. These were independent nations that under the communists were formally annexed to become part of Russia. And that includes the Ukraine. So why the Ukraine is important and these other countries is they each have a significant Russian ethnic minority, Russians that essentially moved there during the Soviet era. And they represent a really kind of a foothold into Western Europe in which the Russians have enormous influence. So we talk about Ukraine, but there's actually three countries: Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. What do they all have in common? They were all former Soviet countries which declared their independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They all have significant Russian ethnic minorities. They all border Russia, and every one of them has been partially invaded and occupied by the Russians. So we have Crimea and the Donbass in Ukraine. We have Transnistria and Georgia, and we have a portion of Moldova, which is Abkhazia, which is also controlled by the Russians. And,
so, James,
and the reason why Putin does this is because this essentially is a launching pad because all of these countries would prefer to be with the West. They'd all prefer to be part of the EU. Georgia and Ukraine would be part of NATO tomorrow if we would have them. So Putin uses his pressure on them as a way to threaten the West. And since they all strategically border very important countries, I mean, Ukraine pushes right into the border of NATO. The former Soviet country, the former Warsaw Pact countries, which now fear Putin, Poland, Romania, they see this as a real threat. So it's like if you had an angry sore on your arm, and every time you wanted to cause pain, you had somebody punch that thing. That's what Putin has in the Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia.
So would it be fair to say that Ukraine is the biggest domino? And would you expect if they went into Ukraine, they would quickly go to Moldova, quickly go to Georgia?
Well, Ukraine is the most important of the three because it is the closest to Europe. It's the closest to trying to join the European Union, to try to join NATO. And it strategically sits along the Black Sea, which is incredibly valuable in terms of the Russians. If you want to actually have military control of the Black Sea, then controlling Ukraine is tremendously valuable. And not to mention, Ukraine has a number of resources and strategic advantages, including a tremendous capacity to produce food. So it is it is the most valuable one. But every one of these strengthens Putin's control over his sphere of influence and allows him to put additional pressure on the countries in the border. And eventually what he's looking for is, we all know Ukraine's not part of NATO. And so therefore you cannot invoke Article 5, which is the common defense of the NATO community. But Putin, with every advance, it allows him to put pressure. And what he eventually wants to do is to create a situation where he does something and it's a violation of Article 5 and NATO does nothing. Because what that will do is really precipitate, he believes, the collapse of NATO and the withdrawal of the United States from Europe. And then a Europe not backed by the United States, to him is just a bunch of squabbling countries where he can exert his control. And that really provides the ultimate security for Russia. And as much as we talk about the Russians aligning with the Chinese, the Russians don't really want to be a suburb of Moscow. They want to be an independent power. And if they can have predominant influence over Western Europe and also access to the Middle East, in their terms, they'll punch of equal weight with the Chinese. And this will be the restoration of the greater Russia, which Putin has always desired.
So what has deterred him to this point? Because this situation has been the way it is for quite some time. What has deterred Putin from trying to take over? And there's been skirmishes on the border, I know, but taking a more aggressive action to try to take Ukraine up until now. And can that situation be maintained in the future?
Yeah, well, the answer to that question is actually really easy. It was Donald Trump. Look, the first big bite of the Ukraine happened under Obama. When Trump came into office, the Russians really worried about him. There's a very famous incident happened in Syria where some Russian mercenaries attacked a US base, and Trump basically ordered an airstrike and wiped them off the face of the earth. And the Russians got the message. So the Russians actually worried that pushing too hard with Trump in office could provoke a serious reaction. And so they sat back. And then I think two things really happened. One was Afghanistan. I think in Afghanistan, they really saw how bad Biden reacted under crisis, and it was bad. And not only did he not have a good plan, but he really spent the entire crisis running around trying to make excuses how it wasn't his fault and not dealing with the crisis. So I think they saw a weak leader. And then they looked around Biden, and what they saw, all the same Obama people that they exploited for 8 years. So I think they moved forward on this next step with a lot of confidence. So there's a really simple reason why they attacked Ukraine under Obama, and that for 4 years they didn't dare. And then when Biden came on back in office and they got the measure of the man, they just picked up where they left off. I think it's completely predictable.
One of the recommendations that you've made in handling this situation is Congress taking action on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Why is a pipeline important in this conversation?
So this is a pipeline between Russia and Germany. And there's two things. One is, of course, if it's an operation, Russia will make a ton of money of it. And they use that money to threaten other countries, like what they're doing in the Ukraine. I mean, putting 100,000 people on Ukraine's border is expensive. How can the Russians afford that? They have an economy that's the size of Texas. And the answer is because they make a ton of money off of selling energy, and they use that money to threaten their neighbors. But the other thing is if the Russians have a pipeline that goes to Germany, they essentially can bypass the pipeline that goes through the Ukraine. And what that really means is they can cut off energy supplies to some European countries and not others. And so they can really use that as a tool to threaten countries. So we've already seen, for example, the Italians came online and they said, Biden says we're going to have to do sanctions if they attack the Ukraine. Well, does that include cutting off buying gas from Russia? Because I got to tell you, in the middle of the winter, we can't do that. Mm-hmm. So Nord Stream 2 would allow additional power of Putin to really manage European energy markets. So there are a lot of European initiatives that look about moving gas other ways and other forces of energy. But the Russian gas would undercut all of those, and all those projects would die on the vine. And that would just mean Europe is more dependent on Russia, and that means more energy blackmail. That's why many people think that the very first thing we should do, if we want to show the Russians we're serious, is to not have that pipeline open. Of course, the pipeline's owned by the Germans and the Russians, but the US can sanction people that use or operate that pipeline, and that can be quite effective. You know, it's funny, the Biden administration has been completely feckless on this thing, because when they came in office, they said, well, the pipeline's almost completed. We can't really do anything. But look, a pipeline that's not 100% constructed and not 100% working is 100% useless because it's not doing anything. So that was a lie. And now they've turned around and said, well, you know, we'll threaten this. But when this law was proposed in Congress, the administration actually opposes a law which would allow us to put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. So I'm not really sure the administration takes that seriously. But
James,
but the frustrating point is we're not going to get Russia to back down unless they know.
James, we are out of time. Sadly, I knew we were going to go long on this, but we really appreciate you being with us. We're going to have to do this again because there's so much more to get to. But thanks for being with us today, very much.
Hey, thanks for having me.